when you make it as an offering to God, there is nothing to get from it. We're back with another reflection on the daily Vedantic, and I love talking about this guy. It's come up on the podcast before, definitely on Yoga for Your Intellect, and it's the producer Rick Rubin, who in his latest book, and certainly in a lot of conversations on podcasts, when the book comes up, has talked a lot about making your craft, your art, an offering to God, as opposed to an egoistic expression or an instrument in order to have some commercial windfall, but the power of making it an offering to God. My wife and I have chatted about this numerous times, and we were chatting about it recently, that it's such an empowering, liberating inspiration and intention behind creating. She's an artist, a painter, and whether it's company stuff, this podcast, Yoga for Your Intellect, the other podcast on this philosophy that I co-host, the whatever it is, music that I make, it's so simplifying and liberating to make the goal an offering to God. Now, Rick does not subscribe to a religious tradition. He's not in any way a religious figure. But the way that he talked about this maybe about 2 months ago in a podcast episode was so beautiful. And that he said he kept seeing this pattern that the most prolific artists were producing their art for a higher purpose. And many of them would use the word God, that he got to a point where he realized he wasn't saying what he was noticing internally. Of make your art an offering to God and see what happens. Just see what unfolds. Doesn't need to be a one-way door where you say, okay, now I'm going to be an accountant and make an offering to God. I'm going to turn my startup into an offering for God forever. It could be two-way door. You just try it out for 2 weeks. But he said that he started to notice that that was the only wording or only articulation within him that made sense to describe what these generational artists were doing, their intention behind their art, the ones that had their entire lives dialed in. There were some that were very prolific, but degenerating with each album, degenerating decade over decade. But the ones that were flourishing decade over decade had a very strong spiritual base and rationale behind their art. He used one example of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, where they're a band that stayed together for 30, almost 35 years, continuing to make art together and always with this reverential wonderment of making their art, their albums, an offering to God. The contrary, he said, was Tom Petty. Tom Petty got to a point in his life where he just would never leave his house. I think the words he used was he would just read books all day long, wouldn't even go out to eat, just became a hermit that would leave his house occasionally to go on tour to pay for the house right on the beach in Malibu. And then ultimately, as many of us know, passed away from drug overdose while on tour. And then you have completely sober musicians in Red Hot Chili Peppers that probably very few would have expected them to become sober, that are still making their art as a band, sticking together as a band. That's pretty crazy for 10 years, much less nearly 40, but still making their art. And each album, according to Rick, having even more energy coming into the studio instead of less and less. Those are just anecdotes and stories of his, of working with nearly all of the best artists over the last 45 years of making albums and helping artists bring their art to life. So, like anything on this podcast or anything within Vedanta, if it doesn't make sense to you, leave it on the shelf. There's something amazing about that articulation. Making an offering to God. something that takes ourselves out of the equation, that has no commercial, critical, admiration outcome tied to it whatsoever. There's nothing to get when you make it an offering to God. When you make it an offering to God, well, in one sense it's true. There is nothing to get from it. But in a beautifully paradoxical, purely Gita way, purely Vedantic. This is straight from the Gita. When we are unattached to the outcomes, that's when all of our outcomes, all of the fruit that we can bear flourishes. When we make it an offering to God, whatever that craft, whatever your art is, when you make it an offering to God, try it for a week, try it for an afternoon, try it for a year. But maybe the opposite is just as true when it comes to the art that you obsessively care about. When you make it an offering to God, you get nothing and you get everything you ever wanted. Paradoxical, and yet it is what all major traditions have been saying for thousands of years. Certainly what Vedanta has been saying for 8,000 years. And that is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.